Welcome to the B&H Photo Event Space, live in New York City. All of you in the room here with me, thank you. And those of you watching online, live streaming, I'm Tim Gray. More about that in just a moment. First, let's talk about what we're here to talk about. And that is mistakes to avoid in Lightroom. How many of you have already made some mistakes in Lightroom? Whoa, everybody. And perfectly proud to let everybody know that they've made a mess of their catalog. Well, first, let's make sure that there's not too much in the way of confusion about what we're here to talk about, because Lightroom has become a little bit of an ambiguous topic, you might say. So it's not just Lightroom. As we know, of course, it's Adobe Lightroom. But more specifically now, it's Adobe Lightroom Classic CC. Well, technically, actually, Photoshop is still part of that name. So it's Adobe Photoshop Lightroom Classic CC, not to be confused with what was formerly known as Lightroom CC. So don't confuse yourself. Anybody confused besides me? So we'll stick with Lightroom. How's that? So by and large today, I'm going to be talking about Lightroom Classic CC. We will give some mention to the new Lightroom CC that replaced what used to be called Lightroom CC, creating a brand new product, well, no, an old product that now has a new name. I'm already confused again. But Lightroom. So mostly how to avoid mistakes, common mistakes in Lightroom, mistakes that I'm sure some of you have probably made along the way. And we'll talk about how you, number one, avoid them and maybe fix some of those as well. So some gasps. Don't worry, we had some engineers check the safety of these rocks before I went out there and sat down. It's the Grand Canyon. It's so stable, it's not going anywhere, right? Yeah. So I like getting out in the world and taking pictures, of course, and then trying to make sure that I can actually find those pictures, especially pictures of myself, so that I can share those and make people gasp at the cliff that I was sitting at the edge of, etc. And many of you, how many of you are already getting my daily Ask Tim Gray email newsletter? A few of you, thank you very much. So it's hard to believe. It makes me feel old every time I talk about it, but I've been answering questions from photographers in the Ask Tim Gray email newsletter for something like 16 years now. Which feels like not only did I predate digital, but I predated photography somehow. And more recently, producing lots and lots of video training content through my Gray Learning website. I have lost track. We've got dozens and dozens of courses representing thousands of lessons and hundreds of hours worth of content. It's crazy to think about how much time I've spent in a studio or in front of a computer making those videos. And speaking of videos, you can find me on YouTube, youtube.com/TimGrayTV. And if you want to see some pictures, how many of you are already following me on Instagram? How many are going to start following me on Instagram and go home tonight and like every single photo that I've posted? I mean, wonderful. Thank you so much. My self-esteem just took a big boost. So why are we here? Because most of you have already made mistakes in Lightroom and probably are trying to figure out how to avoid them and how to fix them. I guess it's sort of funny. I came out with this video course a while back called Cleaning Up Your Mess in Lightroom. Mostly just in response to getting so many inquiries from photographers, emails from photographers saying, I got this problem. All my photos and all my folders are missing. They've all got question marks or exclamation marks, and I can't find anything. Can you help me clean things up? And based on my own experience and seeing what photographers were struggling with, we made this video course. It is like far and away the most popular course I have ever created, ever in the history of all of the video training that I've been making over the years. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the most common mistakes that photographers make, that I see those photographers making on a regular basis, and give you some insights into how you can sort of avoid those and hopefully fix them moving forward. So first and foremost, the real big thing that most photographers run into, I used to talk about this as, stop. Basically, the first rule of Lightroom is don't start using it yet, which sounds maybe a little bit negative perhaps. But what I really mean is stop and make sure that you actually understand Lightroom before you start using Lightroom to manage your photos. For how many of you is this advice way too late? But the idea is that if you don't understand how Lightroom works, then you're not really going to be able to make the most of Lightroom. And the problem is Lightroom is a little bit special when it comes to software. You ever download an app on your phone, for example, and you have no hesitation. You just dive in and start playing around with it, right? No big deal. What are you going to do? Break your phone? I suppose it's possible. I have no idea. But there doesn't seem to be a big risk factor, right? When it comes to Lightroom, there is a risk factor. And what that stems from is that Lightroom is not the kind of software that you might be used to in terms of managing your photos. Remember Adobe Bridge? Many of you maybe got your start using Adobe Bridge to manage your photos. You almost might say that Adobe Bridge isn't really managing your photos at all. Really, Adobe Bridge is just a browser So you say, hey, Bridge, I want to see the photos in this folder, or I want to see the photos only with a certain star rating. That's really just kind of Bridge being a portal to various tasks related to image management. It's much simpler, and it's much more difficult to break anything, because you're just looking at your actual photos out there on your hard drive. With Lightroom, we've got a fundamental difference in that there is a catalog and your photos. There is a distinction between your organizational workflow, or the information about your photos, and the photos themselves. One of the potentially scariest consequences of this, I've had more than a couple photographers come up to me asking for help because they imported their photos into Lightroom. They heard it was this great new program and they want to use it so they can be totally streamlined and always find every photo. So they're going to import this entire hard drive full of photos into Lightroom, and then they figured once they had imported everything into Lightroom, they can free up a bunch of storage space on their hard drive by deleting the photos. And they asked me how to recover from this, and I asked them about their backup workflow, because they've just deleted all their photos. And if they didn't have a backup, it's a really bad day for that photographer, because the photos exist separate of Lightroom. It's sort of the same as Adobe Bridge, right? Bridge is just browsing your folders and your photos, but Lightroom seems to be different because we're importing into Lightroom. Well, really, we're just importing the information about our photos into the Lightroom catalog. So think of the catalog, now I'm going to date myself even further. Like, anybody ever gone to the library or remembers what it used to be like to go to the library? And you'd go to the card catalog and you'd look up a subject and you'd flip through and find the Dewey Decimal number for the book you wanted to read, and then you'd go over to the shelves and find that book. Lightroom is much the same. The catalog is the card catalog, and your photos, well, those are the books on the shelves. You can't really have one without the other. What's most important, of course, is the photos. The books on the shelves, because even without the card catalog, you might be able to find your way through the library and dig up a book. But if you're missing the books or the photos, then the catalog suddenly becomes useless. So keep in mind that they are two separate things working together. Now you might say, well, then what's the point of having a catalog if it's going to cause all of this confusion? And many photographers have asked this question and suggested that there shouldn't be a catalog. I would actually argue that this is, all things considered, the best approach. Because by having a catalog that is separate from your photos, now we can search across everything. If you ever tried to search across your entire hard drive full of photos in Adobe Bridge, you'll know that it's a pretty slow process. Because when you tell Adobe Bridge to go searching, it literally is going searching, looking folder by folder and seeing every photo that might have certain criteria, a particular text string in the file name, or a star rating, or a keyword, or whatever the case might be. Lightroom can perform that work a lot faster because it doesn't have to go digging through your hard drive. It's just looking in the catalog. It's just a database file. So just as you can sort of search for an email real quickly just by typing some text, so too can you find any photo. The catalog also contains previews, or generates previews of all of your images, so that even if your, for example, external hard drive is disconnected from your computer, you can still browse all of your photos. So I've got almost 400,000 images in my Lightroom catalog. Even without my external hard drive, I can still search across all of them. I can browse all of them. I can do a lot of work with those images, even in the absence of the original photos. That's really cool in terms of the workflow, but it also adds an additional burden to me. I'll talk more about some of the ways to protect that, but first and foremost is to understand that the situation is that way, that we have a catalog that contains all the information about our photos, and then we have the photos themselves. Now, I mentioned the confusion about Lightroom versus Lightroom, or Lightroom CC versus Lightroom CC that became Lightroom Classic CC, and then the mobile app that used to be called Lightroom Mobile, but now it's also called Lightroom CC. A bit of confusion, but the key point is that there are essentially two versions of Lightroom, at least in terms of the desktop application. So you have what used to be just Lightroom CC, was Lightroom 6 before that, and Lightroom 5 before that, etc. That's now been branded Lightroom Classic CC, and the new Lightroom CC is what we refer to as this cloud-based solution. It gets even more confusing when we talk about cloud-based because the application still sits on your computer. So you don't need to be connected to the internet necessarily to use either version of Lightroom. What it really boils down to, as far as I'm concerned, is where your photos are going to be stored first and foremost. If you're using Lightroom Classic CC, it means your photos are stored locally. they're on your internal hard drive or they're on an external hard drive. You're in charge of managing all of your photos and backing them up, etc. The new cloud version, Lightroom CC, still runs off your computer, but now as soon as you import photos, you download them from your camera to your hard drive, for example, Lightroom will immediately start synchronizing those photos with the cloud. What's the cloud? I have no idea. But it's some cloud-based computing platform somewhere. It's a bunch of servers somewhere. Where? I don't know, mystery location. But all these Adobe servers that can store all of your photos, sort of like if you use Gmail for your email, all of your email exists on some server somewhere that Google's managing. And in theory, a really big company like Adobe can manage all of your data and can back it up safely and provide access to it from virtually anywhere on the planet as long as you've got an internet connection. How many of you feel totally comfortable with all of your photos primarily existing on some server somewhere that you don't even know where it exists? Anybody? I do it with my email, right? I don't even think twice. All my email is on some cloud service managed by Google. But the kicker is, I don't really care too much about my email. If all my email disappeared from my inbox tonight, I'd wake up in a really good mood tomorrow. With my photos, I'm a little more concerned, so I'd be a little more careful. Now, you do have copies potentially locally, but as space fills up, they might disappear on you, but they're always available in the cloud. So that sounds a little scary, right? Especially the way I just described it. What's the advantage of Lightroom CC, this cloud-based solution, is that now all of your photos are available from virtually anywhere. If you've got an internet connection, you can browse your photos on your computer, you can browse your photos on a mobile device using the Lightroom CC mobile application. You can go to lightroom.adobe.com and sign into your Creative Cloud account and access your photos from anywhere with an internet connection and a web browser. Pretty clever, pretty cool. Now, of course, I don't really need to access almost 400,000 of my photos at any given time. But if you organize into collections, et cetera, then you could have access to your key photos very, very easily. So it's mostly a matter of your priorities. Do you want to have access to all of your photos everywhere that you've got an internet connection, or do you want to make sure that you're managing everything locally? You know, it's responsibility versus freedom. I mean, there's all sorts of factors to take into account, but I would say that's the fundamental difference, is where is sort of the primary storage location for your images. So now we've chosen which version of Lightroom is going to make sense for us. For me, by the way, maybe it's obvious, it happens to be Lightroom Classic CC, because I'm a control freak and I want to control all of my photos. I'll back them up, I'll take responsibility for that, but I want them all right here at any given time. And I don't really need all of my photos to be everywhere. And in Lightroom Classic, keep in mind that we can selectively synchronize photos. So my favorite images that I want to be able to show off at any given moment, I can synchronize those so they're available virtually anywhere as well. But once you've chosen Lightroom and you've gotten started using Lightroom, one of the other key mistakes that I see photographers making all the time is having a mess before they start using Lightroom. So you have a big wild mess of folders, a complete mess on your hard drive, and then you just dump it into Lightroom expecting that Lightroom's going to somehow manage everything for you. All you're managing is your existing mess. So to the extent possible, I would suggest cleaning things up on your hard drive before you start using Lightroom. After you start using Lightroom, now you've got to clean it up inside of Lightroom. We'll talk about that potential mistake in just a moment. But so for here, I had to invent some messes because, of course, my hard drives are all totally pristine and perfectly organized with a completely logical folder structure, etc. But here, for example, you see the folder down at the bottom. It's called Trip to Croatia. More about that folder naming structure shortly. But as you could probably imagine, trip is not the word I'm going to look for if I'm trying to find my photos from Croatia. And so if I've got kind of a messy structure on my hard drive before I get into Lightroom, I'm just going to be viewing that mess inside of Lightroom. So if possible, trying to have things cleaned up a little bit ahead of using Lightroom. If not, get it cleaned up inside of Lightroom. Now I mentioned that Lightroom makes use of a catalog. How many catalogs do you need? I'll give you a hint. One of the biggest mistakes that I see a lot of photographers making is using multiple catalogs. That's not to suggest that you couldn't come up with a really good reason to need more than one catalog. But in my experience, whenever a photographer thinks they need more than one catalog, and then they come talk to me about those multiple catalogs, I get convinced more than ever that they too should only be using one catalog. The catalog contains all of the information about your photos. One of the great advantages of that catalog, as I mentioned, is that now you can search across your entire collection, your entire library of photos. So why would you want to break it up? And in my opinion, a big part of this stemmed from the early days of Lightroom, when if you had more than around about 30,000 photos in your Lightroom catalog, performance really suffered significantly. But I hear from a lot of photographers that want multiple catalogs, and they heard these old stories about how Lightroom suffers in terms of performance if you get over about 30,000 photos. That has been fixed, and so I would say that there are very few factors in Lightroom that will cause performance to suffer just because you have a large catalog. Not that there's zero effect, but it's pretty minimal. Believe me, I wouldn't have almost 400,000 photos in a single catalog if I was going to have to be patient with Lightroom. And if you're using multiple catalogs, now your first step in going to find a photo is, oh wait, which catalog is it in? I used to hear the recommendation that every New Year's Day, once you've recovered from partying the night before, you should create a brand new catalog for that calendar year. Right, because I can't remember what year it is half the time, like right now, let alone try and figure out which catalog I need based on the calendar year of capture. So to me, it makes a whole lot more sense to have all of your photos in a single catalog, so it's easy to get to anything you need. Whether it's your personal work versus commercial work, or work for clients versus for something else, I would find other ways to organize inside of Lightroom and keep everything in Lightroom so you can always find everything. You don't have to go searching for a catalog. So I mentioned that with this Lightroom catalog, we need to import our photos into Lightroom. And really what that means is to add the photos to the catalog, using that term a little bit loosely, because within the context of importing, we can add photos, meaning import them but don't copy them anywhere. They're already where they belong. Leave them right where they are, but put them, the information about them, into the catalog. Or I need to copy from my media card to my hard drive so I can leverage that additional capability as well. I hear from a lot of photographers who complain that import in Lightroom, the process of copying photos using Lightroom from your media card to your computer, is not as fast as other methods. Totally true. As a result, they think that what they ought to do is download using one app, and then maybe even go through and triage their images, delete their outtakes, maybe even rename all the photos sometime during that workflow. And then when they're finished with all that, import what remains into their Lightroom catalog. I don't think that's a very good idea, because to me, there's just too much risk that somewhere along the line, you're going to forget to import a certain folder full of images, or you'll never get to the end of that particular workflow and get into the Lightroom phase of your workflow. So I'd rather have everything streamlined as much as possible. So already we can, of course, copy photos from a media card, from your camera, for example, to an external hard drive where you store all of your photos. We can perform that copy operation as part of the import process. To me, that's already a nice additional piece of efficiency. But there's so much more that we can do during the import process. So for example, here's the file handling section of the right panel in the import dialog. We can build previews. So remember, I mentioned that even if your original photos are not available, you've disconnected the external hard drive from your computer, for example, you can still browse your images because Lightroom is creating previews upon import. And you can choose what size. I recommend either standard or 1:1. Standard is, I think, the bare minimum. The other couple of options there, I don't recommend at all, because then you browse a photo, preview needs to be built. So standard, if you don't tend to zoom in on most of your photos, as a general rule. Because if you build larger previews, it takes a little more time and it consumes more hard drive space. If, on the other hand, you tend to zoom in on a pretty good number of your photos, most of your photos, you might say, then those 1:1 previews are going to come in handy, because as soon as you zoom in beyond just a full screen view, now a full-size preview needs to be rendered, a 1:1 preview. So if that describes you, you tend to zoom in on most of your photos, maybe evaluating sharpness or looking for blemishes, then you might want to build those standard, the 1:1 previews. I only need standard because I already know they're all sharp. I already know there's no dust spots on the sensor. No, I just don't tend to zoom in on that many photos. I take so many pictures that by and large I can just go, no, 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 ooh, maybe, and then I zoom in on that one. But again, depends on your particular workflow. Smart previews. If you are going to be working with your photos offline, then you might want to generate smart previews, which enable you to work in the develop module. So when we are using our standard previews or our one-to-one previews, we can see the images, but you go into the develop module and you're not able to work with those images unless the source file is available. If you turn on that checkbox to build smart previews, you'll be building smart previews for all those images. And now, granted, you're using up more hard drive space wherever it is that your catalog exists, but you can work in the develop module. You can even export low resolution or relatively low resolution versions of your image, even if the source file is not available. It's like magic. So for many photographers, that can be a helpful setting. Speaking of helpful setting, do not import suspected duplicates. Have you ever had a scenario where you fill up a card in your camera, let's say halfway, you download the photos, importing them into Lightroom, and then put the card back in your camera, forget to reformat it and capture more photos. Now you go to download again and you've got duplicates of the first half of that card. Anybody? I've never done that, of course. But for those of you who have, this checkbox can be a real lifesaver. Do not import suspected duplicates, so that Lightroom is analyzing some of the basic metadata for your photos, and it can detect whether or not those photos are already in your catalog. So you'll still see them in the import dialog, but the import will be turned off. Basically, the checkbox will be turned off for those photos. One of my, well, I was going to say favorite. Maybe that's a little strong word, because I sort of have a love-hate relationship with this next option, but the ability to make a second copy during import. Essentially make a backup of your photos. For somebody who's paranoid like me, this is wonderful, because now I'm copying photos from my media card to my hard drive, and at the same time I can also copy them to yet another storage location, a separate physical device, so that I've got a separate backup. That's wonderful, because now I can put the card back in the camera and reformat it, and I still have two copies of my photos. The original and a backup, you might say. My only complaint, well, only complaint, just realized how silly that sounds. But my complaint about that make a second copy option is that it's not an exact copy in the sense that the folder structure doesn't match. So I can't use this to have two hard drives look exactly the same. They're copies of the source photos. Any renaming that we apply will apply to both. Metadata updates will not apply. So it's not an exact copy. So I treat that as a temporary backup, but it's still a backup, and I'm real happy to have that. And then add to collection. I mentioned that synchronization capability of Lightroom CC, the newer version, but I also mentioned that Lightroom Classic has a sort of smaller version of synchronization, if you will. Synchronization in Lightroom Classic CC is handled via collections. You add photos to a collection, and you tell Lightroom, please synchronize this collection, and then magically, those collections, the photos that are inside of those collections, will synchronize. So you can see them in Lightroom on your mobile device. You can go to the web browser and view those collections of images. And so you might want to add all images that you're importing to a collection, or maybe you want to use a collection for other purposes to help organize your images, and you can do that right from the start. But wait, there's more. The import dialog has even more stuff. We can rename all of our photos. This is template driven. There's a whole bunch of options based on metadata, etc. I generally would use something simple like custom text plus a sequence number. And you can see the preview down at the bottom. So these were images, for example, from the Palouse this year. So Palouse 2018, and the number 1 is a sequence number, and obviously that'll increase for each additional image that you're downloading. And so that way we've got just a little bit more organization theoretically. What's the real reason to rename your photos? I think it's mostly ego, maybe, or self-marketing, perhaps. Because, you know, IMG_1234, it's not the most meaningful file name, but the reality is most of the time we're not really referencing our photos by file name anyway, so it's probably not that critical. But where those names do come into play is if you're sending an image to a client. So would you rather the file name be something like IMG_1234, or something like Tim Gray is an amazing photographer and you should send him a lot of money, -1234? Just an idea. I mean, or, you know, something maybe more subtle. All right, so we can rename during import. Yep, more. There's more. Oh my goodness, just when you thought we were running out of possible features in the import dialog, we have apply during import. So develop settings. I used to joke about this a little bit. just for fun. And yet there are lots and lots of reasons why you might want to apply the exact same preset, a develop module preset, to all of your photos during import. So for example, if you're a wedding or portrait photographer, but your style is everything is in black and white, if you use a preset, you can then essentially convert all of your photos to black and white. You could always revert to color later if you wanted to, because all of our adjustments in Lightroom are non-destructive. But now you have a basic black and white interpretation of your photo to use as the basis of evaluating the image. So instead of looking at all your color photos and trying to imagine which ones are going to look great in black and white, you can use a preset and convert all of them to black and white. Or in my case, what I do is use an import preset, meaning there are certain adjustments that I want to apply to every single image. And that includes lens corrections, for example, profile-based lens corrections. And so I will apply that. I'll talk more about those presets in just a moment, but I'll apply that as a develop preset right at the point that I'm importing my photos. So I'm essentially changing the default adjustments in Lightroom, you might say. In this case, adding those lens perspective correction types of controls. Maybe I want different noise reduction or sharpening settings or whatever the case might be. I can apply those all during the import process. Metadata. I can create a metadata preset or a template that contains the information that I want added to every single photo. So I can add my copyright information to all the photos so that nobody will ever steal any of my pictures ever again, because they're marked as copywritten in metadata. Image thieves always check metadata, right? I can also add contact information. So when somebody sees one of my photos and says, wow, that's amazing, I want to give this guy some money for his pictures, they'll know how to reach me. And any other metadata, anything that would apply to all of your photos so that you've got at least a baseline of that metadata, especially, again, if you're going to share your photos online or send them to clients, for example. And then finally, keywords. Admittedly, this is not the most useful little bit of metadata to be applying during import, because any keywords you add at this phase of your workflow are being added to every single image that you're importing right now. So I'm on a trip to the Palouse, and I want to add all these photos. I want to import them into my catalog. Well, what did I take pictures of today? Abandoned farmhouses, and red barns, and crop dusters spraying fields, and rolling hills, and canola flowers, and et cetera, none of which I can use as keywords during import. Because while my import contains images of all of those subjects, not every single picture contains all of those subjects. So I need to be a little bit vague, maybe just Palouse, the region that I'm in, and Washington State, the state that I'm in, making sure I didn't accidentally sneak across the border into Idaho in the process. So I have to be a bit vague, not the most useful keywords because they apply very broadly, but I'd rather have some keywords. It just takes a second to enter those in during import, and we've got a little bit more information for the photos. And then the destination, I'll talk more about this shortly in terms of the folder structure, the folder strategy, as it were, but we can specify where we want to copy our photos. So I'm copying them to my external hard drive, but I'm also going to put them into a folder because that's going to give me some base level of overall organization. And so I'll talk about the naming structure specifically, but the idea is that we want to not just dump everything onto the hard drive, but have some base organization. There'll be a couple contexts where I talk about that in more detail. But first and foremost is we have to define by its nature during import which folder are we copying our images to. We need to be thoughtful about that structure. So I find many photographers have a little bit of a confused strategy. I guess that would be maybe a lack of strategy at all in terms of how they're going to name their folders. I mentioned this trip to Croatia folder, not the best name. And my contention is that when it comes to naming folders, they ought to be named based on how you think of your photos. If you come up to me and say, hey, Tim, you got any pictures of whales? Yes. On a trip to Alaska, I photographed some whales, so I'm going to go to an Alaska folder. Or do you got any pictures of red barns and crop dusters? Why, yes, I photographed those all day long in the Palouse, so let's go to my Palouse folders, etc. So usually, it's not always, but I've got pretty good odds with this one. It's usually the engineers who use a date-based folder structure, which I think is just absurd for me, because I can't remember what date it is or was, or, oh, when you photographed those whales, what was the date? I have no idea. I think it might have been in the summertime. That's about as good as I could get. So for me, that doesn't work. And so if I have, the engineering types who claim that a date-based folder structure works for them, I will quiz them publicly to try to show everybody why it doesn't work. And I'll say, okay, so when did you photograph a waterfall? And they'll spit out a date. And okay, a rainbow, and they've got another date. But you see, here's the thing. I don't see their cat. They could be making up dates. How would I know? But they say it works. And if that works for you, not only am I impressed, but I think that's perfectly fine. What I would say, the criteria is, it's not that you need to name a folder the way I name a folder. It's that ideally you want to be able to find your photos at some point, and folders are very often one of the first places we start. So for me, it's not that date is not important. You'll see up here that I've got some folders. There's multiple Italy folders, for example, and they've got dates as part of the name, or at least years in this case. But what's at the beginning of that folder name? That's how they're going to sort alphabetically. Now, thank you very much. Lightroom has a search filter for folders, which is wonderful. So I can search for folder name, essentially, or other criteria, which is pretty cool. But again, the idea is that you're probably browsing a list of folders, and so whatever's at the beginning of a folder name is probably what's most important. It's probably the way you're going to be thinking about your images. So for me, it's not necessarily the right solution for you, but for me, typically, my photography involves going somewhere. It involves travel to some location, and so I usually think about my photos in the context of location. Not always, but more often than not. For somebody who's doing portrait work, it's probably the name of the client. So maybe it's last name, first name, or something like that. If you're a product photographer, it might be the company or the name of the product. There's all sorts of variations on this, but the point is, if possible, use a folder naming structure based on the way you think about your images. And then I get the person who lives in New York City and they're a street photographer. And they explain, they go out shooting multiple days out of the week, and that different neighborhood every day, and the neighborhood doesn't necessarily matter. It's just they're out there taking pictures. I got nothing. Because how are you going to, well, were you in Brooklyn? Oh, yeah, I went to Brooklyn and Queens, and, well, I was in Manhattan. Oh, okay, great. Which neighborhood? Oh, the West Village and the East Village and the Lower East Side, and then I went up to Chelsea, and then I was over here. How are you going to organize that? You're not going to be able to remember what neighborhood you were in necessarily. So now I guess we're back to a date-based structure because that's kind of all you've got left. Or maybe you do them, weeks at a time or months out of the year or whatever the case might be. One thing I would say, if you're thinking about date-based folder, don't forget that you can always filter based on date. So I know the picture was taken in 2017 for some reason. I can filter in Lightroom to say, only show me images that were captured during 2017 or during June of 2017 or on this particular date, etc. If you are a date-based person, now inside of Lightroom, in the import, there is an option to create automatically for you date-based folders. Some photographers love this. For every date that you have captured a photo, one or more photos, you will have a folder. And it will go year, month, and day. That theoretically could be really helpful until you choose the wrong destination. So here, for example, if you take a look up toward the top, I have that 2014 folder. And inside the 2014 folder, I have all these various folders for different dates, each containing some images. And then we get down and we find the 2016 folder. Well, that seems perfectly reasonable. Some images were captured in 2014 and some were captured in 2016, except when I imported the photos for 2016, I was on a folder from 2014. Maybe I used the import to this folder option, for example, and specified the 2014 folder instead of the hard drive. Now I've got a 2016 folder inside of a 2014 folder, each of those containing all sorts of day or date-based folders. And it can get deeper and deeper and deeper. The mess can get bigger and bigger and bigger. So if you're going to take advantage of that option during import to create folders based on date, make sure that you're always importing into the appropriate sort of parent folder. That might be just your hard drive. I'm importing to my Photos external hard drive and letting Lightroom handle the date-based folder structure from there. That's perfectly fine if it works for you. It doesn't work for me because I don't know the date of any of my photos. But if that date-based folder structure makes the most sense for you, that's wonderful. Just be really, really careful in terms of being consistent with that import. This is a big one. Once you've started using Lightroom, everything starts inside of Lightroom. This, ladies and gentlemen, is probably the #1 reason that photographers have completely obliterated their catalog in Lightroom. Because I just want to rename a folder. Even Tim agreed that trip to Croatia 2012, even Tim said that was not a good folder name, so I'm just going to go out to my operating system and I'm going to rename the folder, make it just Croatia 2012, and now I have a much more orderly folder structure. More orderly on your hard drive, more chaos inside of Lightroom, because Lightroom doesn't know that you renamed it. Well, actually, Lightroom sort of knows that you renamed it, but it doesn't know what you renamed it to. All it knows is that it cannot find the folder it's looking for. Because what is it looking for? Trip to Croatia 2012. What's on the hard drive? Not trip to Croatia, just Croatia. And so the folder is missing. And if the folder is missing, it doesn't mean that they've disappeared, that the files are gone. It means Lightroom can't find the photos where they're expected. But if you can't ever reconnect the two, then you might as well have just lost the photos, right? So they're out there on the hard drive, but now we've got to reconnect them. And in the context of a folder, we can right-click on a folder that's got that question mark icon and choose the option to find a missing folder, then go out on the hard drive, in the process kind of muttering to Lightroom, I'm really, really sorry, I renamed the folder without asking you first. So we go out to the hard drive, point to, there is the folder that used to be called Trip to Croatia, now it's just Croatia. Mea culpa, choose, and everything's good. In the case of individual photos, it could be even more tricky. What if you've renamed a bunch of photos? Now you've got to reconnect an IMG_1234 with a Palouse_2018-54321. The naming convention might be totally out of whack. Now you've got to browse photo by photo, and try to reconnect them. It can be a real hassle. When a photographer makes a huge mess in this type of scenario, you know what I hear a lot? Forget it. I'm going to make a brand new catalog and just re-import everything and start from scratch. Because that seems less painful than having to go through and reconnect all of this missing stuff. It can be a real hassle, to be sure. But the risk is then you're losing data. I'll talk more about that shortly. But the information in the catalog can be important information, to be sure. So everything that you want to do, you want to edit a photo in Photoshop? No problem. That's cool. I'll talk about that in a moment. But do it from inside of Lightroom. You want to rename a folder, rename photos, add metadata, add keywords, assign star, anything. No problem. If it can't be done inside of Lightroom, then you could probably send the photo to some other application. But any of those types of tasks must be initiated from inside Lightroom. If you start something outside of Lightroom, Lightroom gets confused. The catalog becomes less valuable, the photographer gets frustrated, and then who do we blame? Not us. Lightroom or Adobe gets the blame. But actually it's that we made a mess somewhere else because we weren't. Now granted, Adobe should have the software immediately on installation say, warning, make sure you initiate everything inside of Lightroom, or make sure you go watch all of Tim's videos to make sure you understand Lightroom first, or something like this, right? But everything should be initiated from inside Lightroom. It'll save you so much trouble down the road. Ignoring keywords. How many of you keyword your images a lot? How many of you forgot what keywords are? You might have seen this really cool feature in the cloud-based Lightroom, Lightroom CC, where you can just type a word and it magically finds your photos. It's really, really cool. It can be a little creepy, but it's really, really cool. Literally, you can just type like Statue of Liberty, and boom, there's your pictures of the Statue of Liberty, or Eiffel Tower. It might be both the one in Paris and the one in Las Vegas, but it's going to be the Eiffel Tower. Every now and then, you'll get some false results, right? I've had, crop duster gets identified as a jet, even though there's clearly a big propeller on the front of it. There'll be some mistakes. But this sort of automatic keywording, this ability to search for the image based on the content, based on image analysis, it's impressive. It's cool. I would still say, though, it doesn't replace keywording, especially because keywording is based on how you think about your photos versus what Adobe's engineers figured out they could do in the background with their real advanced servers. And in fact, keywording, it serves two basic roles. So a keyword not only enables you to search for a photo. So here, what do we got? Statue. I'm searching for a picture of a statue. Remember that statue is really cool. I want to see a picture of that statue, so I search for keyword statue, and there's my image. So that's sort of the search benefit. When I'm looking for something, if I added that something as a keyword to one or more photos, I'm going to be able to find those photos based on a simple keyword search. Then I can't remember where I took that picture. And I sure hope I put a keyword. Or, of course I remember. It's Opatya. Now spell it. Yeah. Good luck. Thank goodness I added it as a keyword, so I have some hope of being able to spell it correctly at some point in the future. So keywords are kind of two-directional. One is for searching to go find the photos, but the other is once you've found a photo, it can remind you of some of those details about the content of the image, location, whatever the case might be. So how much keywording are you going to do? How much time do I want to spend keywording? None. I just want them to magically appear. When I'm searching for a photo, how much time do I wish I had spent keywording? A lot more. So, the balance is somewhere in between, right? But at least what I say is for your best photos. So once you've assigned star ratings, for example, to pick which photos are your favorites, maybe filter based on those star ratings and add at least some basic keywords, especially the things you might forget. If it's a picture of the Statue of Liberty, I'm probably not going to need to be reminded of what that statue is. I might want to be able to search for it, but maybe it's not so difficult to just go to my New York City folders and filter by star ratings, for example. So how valuable are they? I don't know, it depends, but certainly there's that element of being able to remind yourself. The things that you're likely to forget that you might want to know. Do I need to know, what kind of bird that is in the statue? Probably not. So I can be selective and at least some of the key elements for those keywords. And also consider what I call fake keywords. But what would be a real keyword for this image? Door, maybe black and white, Rome, Italy. As it turns out, this is near Campo dei Fiori, so Campo dei Fiori is a keyword as well. But if we take a look at the actual keywords that were added, you'll notice that I also have a keyword called Instagram share. And in fact, it's all one word, just because that's how I did it. So this is what I call a fake keyword in that it's not a keyword that describes the content of the image, but rather helps me to identify images for a different purpose. Specifically, you'll never guess. It's a tricky one. But in this case, that fake keyword means that this is an image that I have shared on Instagram. That's how you decode that secret fake keyword. Yeah, so I've shared an image on Instagram, or maybe shared to Facebook or 500px or whatever site you might be using to share your photos. Maybe you created an ebook featuring your photos, so you make a keyword, ebook, Rome, or whatever the case might be. So keywords that sort of describe projects. Yeah, you could also, of course, use collections in Lightroom for this type of purpose. More on that in a moment. All right, so we've got that fake keyword that's there. It's just for organization. It's just for me to keep photos from projects organized in some way. That's all metadata, of course, right? So we've got all this metadata, and I mentioned that Lightroom's catalog contains the information about your photos, but the photos exist sort of separately. I'm not totally crazy about the photos existing totally separately of the metadata, so to speak, of the information in the catalog. So for example, if you add a keyword to an image in Lightroom, by default, that keyword goes into your Lightroom catalog. It does not go into your photo. So if you use Adobe Bridge, for example, to browse your photos, you will not see the keywords that you added in Lightroom. The metadata that you add in Lightroom, by default, only exists inside of Lightroom. Well, there's a couple reasons that I would like to have all of my metadata out on the hard drive with the images themselves. Number one is that I've got that interop between applications in, so I can browse photos using something other than Lightroom if it's expedient for some reason, making sure not to make any changes outside of Lightroom, of course. But I could just browse with Adobe Bridge or some other software, real quickly look at the image on the hard drive and see the keywords that I added in Lightroom if I've saved that metadata out to the photos. In addition, it gives me a little bit of a backup for that information, so that it's not only in the catalog, it's also with the photos themselves. I'll talk more about why that's important to me a little bit later. But inside of the catalog settings dialog, on the metadata tab, there is a checkbox there that I've highlighted, automatically write changes into XMP. .xmp being an XML file format that can contain the metadata for your photos, well, they don't really mean XMP. It means XMP, a sidecar file, if we're talking about proprietary raw captures. So your Canon versus Nikon versus Sony, et cetera, proprietary raw captures. In those types of scenarios with those proprietary files, essentially Adobe wants to avoid writing to those files directly just to be on the safe side. And so instead, the metadata, when you save it out to the files, will be saved in a little sidecar file. It'll have the same base file name, so my img_1234, and then the file name extension of your raw capture format. And then you'll also have that same base file name with a .xmp file name extension. So it's the information about the raw capture remaining separate from the raw capture itself. With this checkbox turned on, however, metadata for other file types, so TIFF images and JPEG images and Adobe DNG images, for example, that metadata will be written to the actual files themselves. So you won't see a sidecar file in those cases. There's also an additional option down below. If you've turned on that first checkbox and you turn on the second checkbox, then any date or time changes that you apply to your photos will also be written to the source image, which would mean, in this case, altering the original raw capture. Now, I've never had to use this feature, of course, this changing the date or time feature, right? That would imply that I traveled somewhere and then forgot to change the time zone on my camera. So I've never done that. Anybody else ever? No? But hypothetically speaking, if I ever forgot to change the time on the camera, I could change it in Lightroom, and this would basically hide the evidence, right? I would actually be changing the original capture time for those photos. Do you really want to do that with a proprietary raw capture? There's a certain degree of risk that the file will get corrupted as part of that process. I consider the risk to be pretty small, plus I've already got several backups of my photos, so it's not something I worry about too much, but proceed with caution in any event. Speaking of proceeding with caution, how many of you back up everything on a regular basis? How many of you back up so well that if a hard drive fails, you're just like, oh, I guess I'll go to B&H now and buy another hard drive. And while I'm at it, I'll take a look at that lens I've been thinking about. Anybody? How many would have a panic attack if a hard drive failed right now? Yeah. Fortunately, I'm in the group that doesn't worry. It's a minor annoyance because I back up so many times, it's ridiculous, right? It's bordering on like an OCD complex. Number one, Lightroom is going to remind you periodically, by default once a week, to back up your catalog. How many of you on a regular basis click that skip until next week button? That's kind of like the I'll go to the gym tomorrow button, and then suddenly it's like 3 years and you don't even remember which gym you're a member of. So I do recommend performing this backup, even if you've got a bulletproof backup system for your overall system, because there's 2 extra checkboxes there. One, as part of this backup process, Lightroom can test the integrity of your backup, of your catalog, I should say, before backing up, and it can also optimize your catalog after that backup. So once we've got a secure copy, a backup of your catalog, then Lightroom can optimize the catalog, which can help improve overall performance in Lightroom. Both of those can be important steps to perform on a somewhat regular basis. So this is one backup. This is only backing up your catalog. This is not backing up your photos. But the catalog's important too, right? And more importantly, I want to try to make sure that my catalog is optimized and is not getting corrupted over time. And so I like to take advantage of this backup feature, even though I've got a really good backup of my overall system on a regular basis. You know, I'm using, for example, Time Machine to back up my computer. I've got my catalog on the internal hard drive of that computer. So I'm backing up with Time Machine on a regular basis. I don't really need this backup, but better to have too many backups than not enough, and I'd like to have that integrity check plus the optimization performed on a regular basis as well. But again, this is only a backup of the information about your photos. It's not a backup of the photos themselves. And so the other step that I'll perform is to actually back up the photos. My personal preference, so circling back to that backup during import, the ability to create an additional copy of the photos during import, and I mentioned that the folder name, for example, won't match because I might have a Palouse 2018 folder, but the backup is going to be imported on and the date. So the folder structure for the backup doesn't match my real hard drive folder structure. I don't like that. I want my backup to be an exact copy. Part of the reason I don't really sweat it if a hard drive fails is that I know that I have an exact copy. I literally, if I had my Photos hard drive fail, I could disconnect it, plug in my backup, and get back to work. Now in reality, I'm going to run, not walk to B&H and buy another hard drive so that I can replace the original with another backup and make a third backup just to be safe, etc. But my backup is an exact copy. I happen to use a piece of software called GoodSync. There's a link here if you want to check it out for yourself, timgray.me/graybackup. GoodSync it's just a solution that I found works well for me. You create these jobs. I want to create a backup of my Photos drive to my Photos backup drive, or my Photos drive to my second Photos backup drive, or my data drive to my backup data drive, et cetera, et cetera. So you define these jobs, and then periodically, whenever you want to make a backup, hopefully somewhat regularly, you connect both of those drives, and you tell it to analyze and synchronize based on that job. So compare my Photos drive to my Photos backup drive, and anything that's changed since the last time I backed up, only update those things. So for example, only copy the photos that I've downloaded since the last backup. Really convenient, doesn't take very much time at all, and it makes me feel really, really confident in my backup because I've got multiple backup hard drives that are an exact match of the source drive. There's another option that you might consider taking advantage of periodically, and that is, it's actually an export feature. It's not exactly designed as a backup feature. It would be more a way to transport images from your Lightroom catalog to somewhere else. And what we're doing then is creating a backup of the catalog plus the photos. So we're exporting as a catalog. So from the file menu, you'll find an export as catalog command. And when you choose that option, you get a dialog like this, sort of like the save dialog or the file open dialog. So I can navigate to the location. Maybe I want to take some photos or have somebody go work on some photos. I can export photos onto another external hard drive. So the reason I think of this as a backup is that you could simply select every single photo in your entire catalog. So inside of Lightroom, go to the catalog section of the left panel in the library module, and you'll find all photographs. Then select all, and file export as catalog. It'll ask what you want to call the catalog. So you just give it a name. It's a full backup, because now I'm going to back up the catalog plus all of my photos all in one big process. I hope you've got a really big external hard drive to copy all this stuff to, right? One of the key settings, it's like one of the most amusing options in all of Lightroom. I hope they never change this because I chuckle every time I see it. Down at the bottom, there's a little checkbox down there that you might not be able to even see. Let's take a closer look. Export negative files. Is that gonna make inverted copies of, what would be negative, the negative value of a photo? Is like particles and antiparticles or something? That's the source image. So I guess whoever made this dialogue at Adobe was like an avid film photographer. Not even slides, but negatives. Because this could have been like transparencies, right? That means export the original image files. So like your raw captures or your DNGs or your JPEGs or whatever it might be. So that lovely checkbox, export negative files, is what will cause you to be exporting copies of the photos as well. So we're exporting every single picture, based on the approach I just suggested, with a catalog. So you could literally take this external hard drive to any other computer that's got Lightroom installed, open up that catalog, and you have everything right there. Now, obviously, if we're making copies of all our photos, we still have the originals at home, and now we've got this copy somewhere else. If you start making changes on that hard drive, they're not going to be reflected over at home on your normal computer. So it really is something I would think of as a backup, but that's a backup of everything. So not a bad idea to periodically make a backup of absolutely everything related to your photos in the context of your Lightroom-based workflow. All right. Does anybody ever get lost inside of Lightroom, speaking of which? No? How about getting lost on the map? So how many of you use the map module in Lightroom on a regular basis? How many of you didn't even know that a map module existed in Lightroom? How many of you have a camera with a built-in GPS receiver that is capable of adding GPS coordinates to every single photo you capture as you capture them. I'll bet you do. Smartphone. You've got GPS built in. A lot of compact cameras, a lot of mirrorless cameras, and a reasonable number of SLRs. In fact, I made my decision about which SLR to buy most recently based on whether or not it had a GPS receiver. It was a choice between camera A and camera B, but camera A had a GPS receiver. I chose that over more megapixels, faster frame rate, and some other features, because to me, since most of my photography is done while I'm traveling, the location information was more valuable. And so for my photos, they show up on the map automatically. So we've got all these little push pins with numbers representing how many photos were captured in that particular location, or nearly so. As you zoom in, they'll start to spread out as you get closer and closer in on the map, but all automatically. I don't have to think about it. So photos captured with my iPhone, photos captured with my digital SLR, all show up on the map automatically. But even if you're not so equipped, there's a few other options that you could take advantage of if the location for those photos is helpful. To begin with, you could simply drag and drop. You can drag photos from the film strip onto the map in the map module. So if we take a step back here, any of those photos, I could just simply drag and drop right onto the map in their appropriate location, and instantly GPS coordinates are added to metadata for the images, or one or more images. Those images appear on the map. So I can go browsing for the photos on the map itself. I could also capture what I refer to as a location snapshot. Before I got my digital SLR that has a GPS receiver built into it, I would carry my smartphone, and when I wanted to know the location, so I get into a piazza in Rome, let me snap a quick snapshot that sort of shows the overall area. Now I have that location marked with my smartphone capture. I could import that into my Lightroom catalog, and now I could use that as a reference to the other photos that were captured at around about the same time, because of course the clock will be set correctly on both my smartphone and on my digital SLR, because as soon as we landed I would have changed time zones on my camera, right? Of course, I would never forget that, ever. Except that once. No, I'm kidding. I was just trying to be humble. Yeah. So, fortunately, as you saw, we can correct that, but ideally both set at the same time. Ideally both have GPS receivers built in, but we can use our smartphone captures as a reference. Or you could use a smartphone or another GPS-enabled device, a navigator, for example, to record a track log. And you can actually import the track log into Lightroom and then synchronize your track log with your photos, and boom, your photos magically appear on the map right inside of Lightroom with GPS coordinates added in metadata, including, by the way, elevation data if the GPS receiver is recording that. And I don't know how well you can see it from here, but you can see the photo, that's a barn that is highlighted down on the film strip. So you got 47 degrees north, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got our latitude and longitude at an altitude of 2,364.8 feet. As an artist, I decided to just lift the camera up an extra 0.8 feet to get a better angle on the barn. And I happen to be facing northeast at the time, so it actually knows which direction my camera was pointing. Now, why do I need to know which direction I was pointing? Probably I never do, but it sure is cool that it's there anyway. All right, so a variety of ways that we can get those photos onto the map, either just completely automatically where you don't even have to think about it, or with these various other methods that I mentioned, so that you can use that map either as a reminder, wait, where did I capture this photo? I want to go photograph that barn again. How do I get to it? Or sometimes I'll just search around on the map looking for photos based on location, because it sort of serves as a reminder, oh, right, when I was in such and such a town, that was some really cool thing I photographed that I don't even remember the name of, but I can find it on the map. Another thing to consider, mistake that I find a lot of photographers making, is sort of ignoring automation, you might say. And I talked about this a little bit when we were talking about importing, but finding ways to streamline your workflow. When you're adding information to your images, is there a way to make that process go a little bit quicker? So I made reference to the metadata presets that we can use, so I can add my name and my email address and my phone number, et cetera, and my copyright information. I can add all of that into a template and then use that as my metadata template during import. So now every photo I import just gets my information automatically. So when I send photos to clients, I don't have to worry, oh, did I remember to add my phone number and email so the client knows how to reach me? It's just there. Similarly, a couple other examples, develop presets. So I also made mention of during import, applying a preset so that we can apply changes in the develop module. It's sort of like changing the default settings in the develop module. And so here you can see I've got lens correction. So I want to use a profile-based lens correction. So correct for any distortion. Maybe I was using a wide-angle lens. We're going to have a little bit of barrel distortion perhaps. And so I want to use that profile for the lens based on what's in metadata to automatically apply that correction. Or maybe correct for vignetting on a wide-angle lens, for example. So all automatic and all based on the actual lens that was used. So Lightroom will look in metadata, see which lens was used, see if an appropriate profile is available for that lens, and if so, apply that one, and if not, it won't apply any. Correct for chromatic aberration, etc. Noise reduction, maybe I prefer to alter the default settings for noise reduction. For sharpening, I want to certainly include process version. So I can pick and choose which changes I want to apply when I apply this preset, and then apply it when appropriate. So in this example, during the import process, make all of these changes to the appearance of the image, every single image, right at the import, including, by the way, that auto settings checkbox up toward the top left. With a relatively recent release, when exactly, I don't know. But in the last, I don't know, I think in the last month, give or take. I've lost all track of time, of course. But a new update to those auto settings. So auto has existed, a little auto button above your basic settings for those tone, the white point and the black point and highlights and shadows, exposure, etc. There was a significant improvement to the algorithm there. Will this make every single photo look absolutely perfect so you don't need to alter the adjustments at all? I wouldn't count on that. But I would say in most cases it looks a little bit better, at least, than your default settings. So it's just adding a little degree of interpretation to the photo. Will it be perfect? No. Will it be better than what you started with? I would say most of the time now, not necessarily always, but usually it gives me at least a better preview and a nice starting point for the images. So I'll generally include that as well. Another, if you export photos at all, another preset that can be very helpful is an export preset. I can't tell you how many times I'll see somebody that they're exporting photos for their blog or for Facebook or Instagram, and they're going through all of the different settings. What type of file do you want to create? What pixel dimensions do you want? What color space do you want to convert to, et cetera, et cetera? Do you want to add a watermark in a color space profile? Once you've established these settings in the export dialog, you can simply click that button down at the bottom left to add, and you can give it a name. So here I've got my Instagram share option, this preset that I've created. In theory, I could just send photos directly from inside of Lightroom to various services for sharing, various published services. But I also export my photos to a folder so that I can then have them synchronized via iTunes to my phone, so that all my Instagram photos are right here. I don't have to pull up the Instagram app. I don't have to have internet access. I've just got them as a synchronized album on my device. So I can specify, where I want to put them and what I want to call them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the pixel dimensions. So that now when I want to export a few photos so that I can share them to Instagram, I just select the images, choose export, choose my preset, click the button, and I'm done. I don't have to look at any of those settings. I know that it's already configured exactly the way I want it. So this mostly comes down to laziness, doesn't it? I often say, if you want to learn the most efficient way to do something, find somebody lazy to teach you how to do it, because they've already figured out the fastest, easiest, laziest way to accomplish it, and then you can benefit from their workflow efficiency. That's what they call it sometimes. It's really laziness, but workflow efficiency, laziness, kind of the same thing. Forgetting about search options. This one's actually pretty cool in the sense that there's so many ways that we could find our photos inside of Lightroom. The way I typically describe this is that whatever you can remember about your pictures, there's a pretty good chance you could find your pictures in Lightroom based on that. Not always, but let's consider, for example, if we use star ratings to identify our favorite photos, and obviously we're using some form of a folder structure. So I went to Alaska, and I was, an 8-day trip, and I captured something like 10 or 15,000 photos. But I've got almost 400,000 photos in my catalog. So searching or filtering, it's really a process of narrowing down the number of images we're looking at. So if you go into my Lightroom catalog, you might be looking at almost 400,000 photos. You click the folder for that particular trip to Alaska, and we're down to something like 10,000 photos. Then you filter based on star ratings, and I might be down to something like 400 photos. Then I also add a keyword to that search. I only want to see pictures of whales, and now it might be a couple dozen pictures that meet that criteria. A couple dozen images, pretty easy to sort through, versus something like 400,000 photos in my overall catalog. So which is faster? Specifying those criteria or scrolling through all 400,000 photos until you hope to stumble upon the particular image that you're looking for. So there's a bunch of ways that we can go about searching for images inside of Lightroom. First and foremost, folders. I talked about that folder structure. I talked about your strategy for how you name those folders so that you can get to the folder hopefully relatively easily. So that if somebody names a subject, you might be able to say, oh yes, I photographed that on this trip or in this location or on this date or whatever the case might be, and we can get to hopefully one or more folders and find the image we're looking for. Keeping in mind, by the way, that you can actually select multiple folders. Another little known trick inside of Lightroom. So if you say, oh, Tim, do you have any photographs in Rome near Campo dei Fiori of a door that's black and white, maybe with a little shadow going across it, hypothetically speaking? I can say, yes, I photographed that scene. In fact, you all saw that picture a little bit earlier today. Hopefully you remember, because it was only like 10 minutes ago. It was in Italy. It was during a trip to Italy, of which they're not even all represented here, but I don't even know how many trips to Italy. Too many to count. Well, not too many to count, because I can count that high if I needed to, but. So I've got, in this case, what is that, 5 folders from Italy, but I can't remember what year, because I'm not good with the dates. I just know it was Italy. Well, I could click on the first Italy folder, hold the Shift key, and click on the last Italy folder, and now I'm browsing all of the photos in all of those selected folders. So folders take on even more utility, even if you can't remember which is which. All right, so we can use folders. Also, upgrade to the latest version of Lightroom. Because in the last couple of updates, there's been some really helpful features that relate to folders. You might see up at the top of my folder list, it's a little bit dim there to see, but there is a search field. So I could type words like Italy, or Palouse, or whatever the case might be, so I can filter the list of folders to only see those that match that text. Pretty cool. And do we have any marked here? Yes, I've got a favorite, that Italy 2017 folder. You might see just a little, looks like a dust speck or something, a specular highlight. That's a little star. That means that folder is marked as a favorite folder. If I go to the left, it's faint there, so you might not be able to see very well, but in that search field where I can type words to search for folders, at the far left, there is a magnifying glass icon. I can click that to get a pop-up, and I can choose the option to only view my favorite folders. So that in this case, do I have any others? No, it looks like I have one favorite folder in this entire list. So instantly, boom, I've just got that one folder on the list. So much easier to get to the right folder. And with a more recent update, Adobe added the ability to apply color labels to folders. So for example, I add a red color label to new folders, and I don't remove that color label until I'm finished going through all of the images in that folder, so that I know at a glance I haven't finished assigning star ratings to the images in this particular folder, for example. So I can use those color labels to mark folders as well, in addition to that ability that we've had for a long time when it comes to our photos. And I can filter based on color labels being added. I can't filter based on specific color labels, but I can filter for with versus all. So with a color label, with favorite status, or all folders. How amazing is that? Collections. So collections are sort of like virtual folders in Lightroom. So we're able to take a random group of images. So a folder for me is typically based on a trip, for example, based on a location maybe. And so I've got a folder from a trip, and I can go find images from that trip. But what if I want to make a calendar? I'm not just going to make a calendar from photos from a single trip. I might make a calendar from photos from a wide variety of trips, so they're disparate. Well, I can create a collection and just add photos from any folder into that collection. And then, of course, I can go find I want to go see the images from that calendar project. Just go to the applicable collection. So again, it's like a folder in terms of how we interact with it, but it's virtual. And you're not making a copy of the photos, by the way, when you add them to a collection. It's just like adding a keyword. We're just adding a little bit of information. Think of it as a collection sort of as a saved search result. The very basic search functionality on the film strip. So up at the top right of the film strip, you'll find some of our key attributes for our images: pick versus reject flags, star ratings, color labels. There's also a pop-up there for saved searches, so I can very quickly filter. So I use, again, that example. Go to a folder, filter based on star rating, boom, I'm down to my favorite images from a particular trip. I could probably find what I'm looking for right at that point, but of course, there's still more. Searching for images based on map location. So we have all these various badges. So at the bottom right of the thumbnail, we have some badges there that indicate that certain things have been done to this image. That leftmost badge, it sort of looks like a push pin because it's basically a push pin from the map. And that is a badge that says there are GPS coordinates embedded in the metadata for this photo. Even better, I can click on that little badge, that push pin, to be taken directly to the map to view where that image was captured. And then, of course, I could browse around on the map to locate specific images. If you click on any of those push pins on the map, you'll see thumbnails, and the images related will get selected down on the film strip. So I could actually go click on push pins and say, wait, what did I photograph over here, and what was over here, etc. So I can actually use the map as a search tool to search for specific images. If that doesn't do the trick, oh my goodness, is there more? What do you remember? So we've talked about some of this already, but on the library filter bar, so you can press the / key on the keyboard to bring up the library filter bar in the library module. It's available as part of the grid view display, essentially. And we can see there's some duplication here. So we have the attribute layer, if you will, and you'll see that we've got flags, so pick flag versus reject flag, or star ratings, or color labels. There's also the addition. So remember, those were on that filter setup at the top right of the film strip. There's also another set of controls here. The master image, meaning the real file, an image that relates to a file on your hard drive, versus a virtual copy, meaning an extra version of the image. It's not an extra copy of the source file. It's just a different interpretation in the develop module. Or videos, because Lightroom can actually manage your video clips in addition to your still photos. So we can filter based on what kind of file we're talking about. Up above that, we've got text. So we might search based on keywords, for example, or any searchable field. So I'm looking for a picture of a whale. I might set this to keyword whale and help narrow things down. Or down below, our metadata setup, and this one, it really gets wild, because we've got these columns. There's 4 columns by default, but you can add additional columns if you'd like. And you can change what each column represents in terms of the information that you're searching for. So here we see that I can search based on date, which means I don't know. I'll say all, because I have no idea what the date was. Or maybe I know it was last year, or whatever the case might be. And I can select multiple years, multiple months, multiple days. Which camera did I use? I don't know. So we move on. Which lens? Ooh, well, I remember that I was using the Tamron 150 to 600 millimeter lens, for example, to capture this image. Or, whatever random details, whatever you can remember, there's probably a way to find that information. You can see here I can also specify file type, so I can say raw capture. I'm looking for long exposure. I could change that to shutter speed and choose a range of shutter speeds from 1 second all the way up to 30 seconds, for example, because I know it was a duration of somewhere more than a second. Or I'm looking for an image with a starburst effect in it. So I search based on lens aperture, f16, f22. Or I don't know, what else can you remember? Sometimes you remember which camera it was, which lens it was. Or I was photographing a wedding and I had somebody else photographing and I need one of their photos. They were using a different camera. Same model though. I can search based on the camera's serial number. So there's all sorts of metadata values that I can filter on so that whatever it is that you can actually remember about the photos that you're looking for, there's a pretty good chance that you can track that down. And even when we're looking at metadata, browsing metadata, see if I have an example here. I do not. But if you're browsing the metadata values, there's a little arrow, right pointing arrow to the right of your metadata that is searchable, so like the lens, for example. And you can just click on that arrow and it sets the filter for you automatically, so you don't have to go up here and specify all of those metadata values sort of manually. But again, point being is there are so many ways that you can track down images inside of Lightroom. I think it's worthwhile to be familiar with what those options are. There's even a bunch of menu commands that are essentially shortcuts for many of these various options as well. I suspect many of you are using Lightroom and Photoshop together, especially when it comes to image cleanup, perhaps, because the content-aware technology does not yet exist inside of Lightroom, because you should also use Photoshop, I guess. So we might have some reasons to continue using Photoshop, even if Lightroom seems to be doing most of the work for you. But I find that a lot of photographers are not implementing Photoshop correctly. So we want to make the use of Photoshop to really exercise a lot of power, whether it's layer masking for targeted adjustments, or image cleanup, or composites, whatever the case might be. On the surface, it's pretty simple. We select an image that we want to open up in Photoshop, then we go to the menu and choose Photo, Edit in Adobe Photoshop. Simple. And if it's a raw capture, that's it. The file just goes to Photoshop. Whatever adjustment settings we've applied inside the Develop module get applied. That raw capture gets rendered as a TIFF or a PSD file, depending on your settings and preferences. And the image opens up in Photoshop. So easy. Then we do whatever we need to do. We add an adjustment layer, we apply a targeted adjustment, we do some image cleanup, taking advantage of that content-aware technology, etc. Then we're finished, and we make a mess of things. Because now I've got to maybe decide which folder I want to put this in and what file name I want to give it, and I want to confuse Lightroom to the best of my ability so that Lightroom will never find this photo ever again. Or I could make it easy. When I'm all finished inside of Photoshop, just 2 steps. Really, really simple. First, file save. Not save as. Because Lightroom already told Photoshop what kind of file to make, TIFF or PSD, again, depending on your preferences settings. And Lightroom already told Photoshop what file name to use. By default, it just adds basically edit on the tail end of it. You can change that in preferences as well. So you don't need to do any save as, just file save. That's it. Command-S, Control-S on the keyboard. Step 2, close. So easy. File save, file close. Again, keyboard shortcuts if you prefer. Command-S, Control-S to save, Command-W, Control-W to close. And you go back into Lightroom, and there's your additional copy. So you've, in this case, in the example I've explained here, taken a raw capture and made a TIFF or a PSD, possibly with lots of layers or all sorts of sophisticated things that you've done inside of Photoshop. File save, file close, back to Lightroom, whatever you did. Let's say you converted it to black and white. Now it's going to look black and white. That copy of the image will look black and white in Lightroom, or whatever it was that you've changed about it. Then you realize you made a mistake, or you want to do some extra stuff in Photoshop, so you want to send it back. No problem. You were paying attention, so we just select the image, edit in, Adobe Photoshop, so easy. Then you get thrown for a loop because Lightroom says, great, what do you want to do? Huh, what? Wait a minute, I didn't have to answer this the first time. Well, do you want to make a copy? Do you want to make a copy, or do you not want to make a copy and edit the original? Except this isn't the original, this is a copy of the original. The original was my raw capture, and then I made a TIFF or a PSD, again, depending on the preferences settings that you've established within Lightroom. So that is a copy, not the original, but I don't want to make another copy, so now I'm confused because it doesn't seem to apply to this image that I'm working on right now. But this is the original of the copy. See, that's how that makes sense. It's a copy of the original, but that makes it an original in its own right, even though it's a copy. Right? Did I explain that well? This copy is the original copy, from not to be mistaken with the original. I mean, did I confuse you more now? So let me see if I can do this again. Here's the problem. I can't think of a better word for this. So I can't even go to Adobe and say, like, you've got this all wrong, you're confusing people, you're using the word original when we're talking about a derivative copy of the original. The original was the raw, this is a TIFF or PSD that's a copy of the raw, but it's the original TIFF or PSD, but it's still a copy. So what should the word be? A source file, maybe, I don't know. But even that, it depends on context a little bit. But until we figure out better words so we can tell Adobe how we want things to be termed inside, I'm sure they'll change it for me. when we're editing an image again in Photoshop, we don't want to make a copy. We want to edit the original. We'll chuckle, all of you, right? Every time you do this now, you'll kind of chuckle. Haha, remember Tim? He was so funny when he explained about the original versus the copy. It was hilarious. Let's go watch that on YouTube again. Please. So edit original, even though this is a derivative copy of the source. That's the option you want. You don't want to make a new copy every single time you resend the photo back to Photoshop. You just want to send the original of this TIFF or PSD with all of those layers intact, so that as you add additional layers or make changes to layers, it doesn't matter. And then when you're finished, what are you going to do?
Save.
File save, file close. Easy breezy, back to Lightroom, everybody's happy. Another mistake, inconsistency. And admittedly, there's reasons for inconsistency. There's valid reasons for inconsistency over time. This picture, what star rating would you assign to this picture?
3.
3. See? It's nice. It's very, very polite. Very considerate. What did I assign to it?
2.
Before you overreact, this was a really long time ago. A really long time ago. This actually might even have been a film shot, I'm not even sure. And like I was so excited because I lived on the central coast of California for a little while. And these elephant seals, they're up in San Simeon, which is like, I was living in San Luis Obispo, so that's like, what, maybe an hour's drive? And I had never been up there. I've been hearing about it for years and years. These elephant seals, and the males fight on the beach, and it's really dramatic. And I went up there on this cloudy, overcast day and got a bunch of lousy pictures of this really exciting subject. Wow, look, they're really going at it. Now go Google like elephant seals fighting, and you'll see what good pictures look like of these subjects. This is not it. But back then, this is my best work, right? Some of you maybe have seen my shot, from high school, which was also pre-digital. Very, very long time ago. But I was so proud of it, and now I look back and laugh at it because it's just horrible. I mean, horrible is maybe a strong word, but it's horrible. So 5-star, this was a 5-star image back in the day. Now this one got a 5-star rating. This one I'm happier with for a good reason, I hope. So, your standards maybe change over time, or hopefully you develop as a photographer, and so, 5 stars isn't what it used to be. Those old 5-star images need to be derated. So some of this you just can't help, right? Because your favorite image from this year might get a 5-star rating. And then 5 years from now, as you improve as a photographer and you look back and you're like, what? Why did I even push the shutter release button for that? That's terrible. I've got so many better images now. At least we hope to develop that dramatically, right? The point is that, your standards will sort of change over time, because 5 stars is always like, this is a portfolio piece. Well, my portfolio from like when the first digital cameras came out to today, I am not too proud to say that those first digital shots were horrible. But they were the best digital shots I had at the time, right? They were the best photos I had. So some of this is just as we develop over time. But then you might alter your workflow over time. So for example, we can use pick or reject flags, star ratings, or color labels to mark our photos. And ostensibly, this is a process of identifying our best from a photo shoot. But what if you used to use pick flags, and then you learned from Tim later in this presentation that you shouldn't use pick flags, so you want to change everything. You want to start using star ratings. So you start using star ratings, but now your older pictures have pick and reject flags, and your newer photos have star ratings. Is that a bad change? No, it might be a good change, but it's inconsistency. So how do we solve for that inconsistency? We go back to all of our pick images and give them at least a default star rating, so that we don't rely upon those pick versus reject flags anymore. Right? Color labels, same sort of thing. So having some degree of consistency, or when you change your mind about your workflow, you change your process, going back and correcting. Remember all those criteria that we can use to find our photos? Let's say that you used to use color labels in the place of star ratings, just as a simple example. So red equals 1, yellow equals 2, green equals 3, etc. Well, we can just go to all photographs, filter by red color label, and add a 1-star rating to those and remove the red color label. and then go to all the yellows and all the greens, et cetera, and just replace one piece of metadata with another, or just add if you're paranoid about removing other metadata. So if you're going to make a change, make sure that you're sort of following through. If we change from a date-based folder structure to a name-based folder structure, you probably want to spend some time going back and renaming the old date-based folders. So making sure that there's consistency in how you approach your workflow, but that when you make a change, you're actually going back and sort of fixing that for your older photos. Consistency in terms of folder structure, that naming structure. We talked about this for a while earlier, so I probably don't need to go into too much detail about it, but making sure that if I'm primarily location-based, that I'm using that consistently, or at least in a consistent structure. So it's always the name of the place and then the year or something to that effect. Realizing, is there an exception here? No, I mean, there's exceptions, but I had, when I moved to New York City, something like 8 years ago, I had this really pretty brilliant idea. I was living in the Seattle area at the time, and I was going to move to New York City, and I thought, you know, what better excuse for a road trip across the country? It was February, so it involved a lot of driving south before I could start moving east, but I, did that road trip. Well, that folder is called Road Trip, as opposed to, United States road trip or something, because in my mind, it's my road trip. Did I say too many trips? So again, it doesn't have to always be exactly the same. It's a location and a date. In my case, it could be some variation on, again, however I think about it. But being consistent, if not in the words you're using, at least in the way you're thinking about that folder structure. Another big one. Any Adobe employees here? Or Adobe informants? So not planning beyond Lightroom. Now, I'm not suggesting that you should abandon Lightroom. I use Lightroom to manage my photos. It's working perfectly great. I'm very happy with it, Adobe. But what if somehow Adobe decided to stop making Lightroom at some point down the road, right? I mean, I used to do film photography. I used to use a film scanner. I used to use zip disks and DVDs and all these things we haven't seen for a long time, right? So things change over time. And I'm a little bit paranoid when it comes to my photos, and I want to protect my photos as much as possible. So I want to be able to move beyond Lightroom should that ever become necessary. I hope not, because Lightroom's working great for my workflow. But I also want to at least have the confidence in knowing that if Lightroom were discontinued for some reason, kind of like Apple discontinued Aperture, that I would have some sort of path forward. So for example, that's part of the reason that I think a folder structure is so important, even if you don't necessarily use folders as the primary basis of your organizational workflow. Because outside of Lightroom, the folders still exist. We've still got some degree of an ability to go through and look for particular images. I mentioned that setting to save metadata out to the files themselves, that checkbox in the catalog settings dialog. And I mentioned that for proprietary raw captures, it makes an XMP sidecar file containing the metadata. Not all of the metadata, though. Only the standard metadata plus your developed settings. So there are a bunch of things, well, not a bunch, but there are a handful of things that will not be preserved. So for example, membership in collections. I mentioned those collections as being a nice way of organizing your photos, except collections only exist inside of Lightroom. So even if you're saving metadata out to the photos themselves, the collections are not part of that metadata because there's no such thing in, EXIF or IPTC metadata called collection for Lightroom. If you create virtual copies, so I mentioned the ability to create a virtual copy that is just a different interpretation of the same source image. You're not duplicating the source file, you're just adding different developed settings. So here I've got full color and a partial color and a black and white, for example, interpretation of the same image. Pick and reject flags, Lightroom specific feature. This is why I prefer not to use pick and reject flags. I use star ratings instead. It's a keeper, it gets some stars. It's not a keeper, it doesn't get any stars. Right? So I'm avoiding pick and reject flags because it's not a standard piece of metadata. It does not exist outside of my Lightroom catalog. So these are just a few of those examples. Does it mean I won't use collections? No. But it means that I'll be thoughtful about my use of collections, and I'll try to have a stopgap, right? So what might I use to replace a collection, to give me insurance against a collection? Simple. Any photo I add to a collection gets a fake keyword. Why did I make the collection? It was to share on Instagram, it was to make a calendar, then I can add a keyword based on that context, based on that type of use. And the keyword is a part of standard metadata, so when I save the metadata out to the files, in my case automatically, that XMP will contain the keywords. It won't contain the collection, but it can contain my keywords. Somewhere down the road, if anybody switched from Aperture to Lightroom, you remember that process of having to export every single photo as a TIFF so that you would see your adjustments, the actual changes you've applied. You would have to do something similar with virtual copies, but you want to be aware of that and consider, is there a way that I can be more efficient? Maybe instead of a virtual copy, I send it over to Photoshop and make an interpretation there so an extra file is created, for example. So again, not to be sort of overly paranoid, but be thoughtful about what the future might hold in terms of your overall workflow. And if you keep all of those things in mind, and implement all of those thoughts and considerations in your workflow, you will never need my Cleaning Up Your Mess in Lightroom course. But should you, there's a link right there where you can get a discount off of the course. I want to thank you guys very much. For those of you joining in person, those of you watching online with the live streaming or the recording later, thanks very much for having me here, for enjoying, I hope, the presentation here at the B&H Photo Event Space. Thank you, and I will hope to see you at another presentation in the very near future.